We have also added closed captioning this month to make our programs more accessible to more people. If that is distracting or you'd like to turn it off, you are able to do so in your Zoom controls, so please feel free to do that. We will be taking your questions at the end. We're going to cover an awful lot of information today, and so please be sure to put your questions in the Q&A, and we will be sure to get to each one of them at the end during the allotted Q&A time. And this session is being recorded and will be shared with you post-event via email. There is a lot of information, and this way you will be able to go back and reference the details that we share today. I would also like to take a moment to thank my team. Big Buzz Idea Group continues to grow and serve a larger number of nonprofits in and around Chicagoland and across the country. And I am just appreciative from the very bottom of my heart for the team that works with me on a daily basis and continues to help me bring these programs to you. So a very special thanks to Brad and Laura, who are behind the scenes this morning, as well as Craig, Shay, and Sarah, who help us do all of the great work that we do on a regular basis. I'd like to give you a little bit of information about Big Buzz Idea Group. I am Melissa Legowski. I'm the founder, owner, and queen bee of Big Buzz. I founded the organization in 2004, and we are a company that powers nonprofit organizations to fuel positive change in the world. I was a past executive director, and I was a staff of one, doing 24 events a year, 12 newsletters, 8 committees, and managing 225 members. I got burnout. I realized that organizations need a company that can help them just occasionally or sometimes on a larger scale with a larger project, and I launched Big Buzz Idea Group. We've been growing ever since and are excited to continue to be able to serve the nonprofit community. We believe that many nonprofit executives lack the time, staff, skills, and funding they need. Big Buzz Idea Group fills gaps in management, marketing, and events, so you can focus on the big picture and position your organization to thrive. We know that managing the day-to-day operations can sometimes get distracting with all of the unexpected fires and Chinese fire drills. So we really want to be able to support you and hope that this information we share with you today will help. We're going to talk about governance and whether or not your organization is compliant. When I started my first stint as an executive director in 1999, I was basically hired, given the keys on day one, and told that that was my office. I was not given any training or information about governance. I had no idea how to run a nonprofit organization and really was left to figure it out as I went. So today we're going to cover a lot of details, a lot of information that I've learned along the way in an effort to help you be able to run your organization more effectively. And because we do have guests on our webinar this morning from across the country, we will share information that I think will apply generally and then give you resources to be able to help you try to find out more specifics for your particular state as well. So what is nonprofit governance? Nonprofit governance is the process of providing strategic leadership to a nonprofit organization. It entails the functions of setting direction, making policy and strategy decisions, overseeing and monitoring organizational performance, and ensuring overall accountability. It is one of the most important roles of your board, and yet, as we talked a few weeks ago about the fact that many board members are not trained on how to be a good board member or don't know all that they should about nonprofit management, so not everybody understands the important role they play in that seat at the table. We're going to help you learn more today so that you can also educate your board and make sure that your organization is running effectively. There are many pieces to overall compliance. There is the IRS, which stands for Internal Revenue Service, and there are requirements that are at the federal level. Every state also has requirements, and we will talk more about that. I know here in Illinois, it is important for organizations to be registered with the Department of Revenue, the Attorney General, and the Secretary of State for different components and different reasons. Not everybody has to register with the Attorney General, but depending on your 501c type, that is a recommendation. And then there's the local government requirements. Some nonprofits also have the national or parent organization that they also have to follow guidelines or rules that are handed down to you. And then of course you have your board and the bylaws that also help keep you compliant. We're going to talk a little bit more about all of these today. I want to start by talking about what I like to call the permanent records. Permanent records are those documents that come with the founding of a nonprofit organization. When I first started as an ED, I was told that we were a nonprofit, we were not a business. I really never believed that, and I have over time become more and more adamant that nonprofits are businesses and they need to run as such. The difference is that because of the 501c privileges that nonprofits are given, that the requirements are more detailed than what I think most businesses are. And it's a little bit harder sometimes with the changing of the guard to keep track of things. Usually with a company, you have a single owner or a group of partners. And so it's easier to manage some of these documents. I'm sure that some of you out there today have received or inherited a nonprofit maybe after several years of existence and not been able to find all of what I call the permanent records. So I want to go over these for just a minute and talk about the importance of them, as I believe these are items that have to always be able to be easily found for any nonprofit to really stay in good compliance. So obviously your 501c application. You know, this again, the 501c status gives you a lot of privileges and opportunities, and knowing how that application was originally filed is incredibly important for your purpose, your mission, and really making sure your documents and your programs and your organization are all aligned. So making sure you know where that original application is important. There's an SS4 application that has to go in to get your federal tax ID number, and being able to know where that is also important, as well as your articles of incorporation that are also generally done at the founding of an organization. As a result of those items, you receive acknowledgments from the federal level and the state level. And so you're going to have a 501c approval that you also want to be able to hold on to. You'll have exemption acknowledgments and letters granting you those privileges. And so it's really important that you're able to find those and provide those as needed to your vendors and your suppliers to be able to avoid paying taxes when appropriate. And then that tax ID assignment is also incredibly important to just make sure you've got the right tax ID and that you're always using that when being able to report out on different pieces with the government. As time goes on, you will also have state ID numbers. You may have a state license number. And so all of those types of things you want to continue to hold in what I call the permanent record file. That makes them easy to find, as well as a completed W-9 can also allow you to easily meet the needs of your suppliers and vendors that you work with. When we talk about governance, we're going to start at the top. And the IRS is where it all begins. So they have you have to file a tax return annually, even if you are a nonprofit and you're not subject to paying taxes, but you still have to report the revenue and share a lot of details, because again, when the government grants you that 501c status, they want to make sure you're adhering to the rules and protocols of the 501c requirements. So making sure that your exemption certificates stay up to date. Obviously, IRS also, there's a requirement around payroll if you have employees. And I know that a lot of people who maybe have never managed a company and this is your first time in an organization, they don't know all that goes into the payroll requirements, but payroll, you know, there is withholding, and then there is the submission of your federal, state, and local taxes, as well as your Social Security and your Medicare payments that have to be submitted on a regular basis. And depending on the volume of your payroll, you have to remit those taxes. Sometimes it's biweekly, sometimes it's monthly, and what have you. But it's important that you know for your level of payroll what is required for your organization. I've unfortunately heard too many stories where people were unaware of how withholding worked. They did not know they needed to remit the withholding amounts and match those. And there's been some really sticky situations where you can get in trouble very quickly with the government. And so I encourage you to make sure that you have an accountant and an attorney as we work through these pieces who specialize in these items to be able to guide you and make sure you're on the right track. There's also a lot of payroll services that exist that can help you with the requirements and the filings. If you're issuing payroll, there's also quarterly returns. They have to be issued at the federal level as well as the state level. And then, of course, the payroll also has to be, there's an annual report that goes in around the payroll, and you have to issue the W-2s. So very important to know all of those pieces. And then there are various licenses and permits that can be needed. And so you want to make sure, again, the IRS.gov has a lot of great information about nonprofit requirements, nonprofit guidance, and I encourage you all to make sure you check it out. I know you're very busy, but making sure that you understand the rules and the guidelines for your particular 501c organization is incredibly important. And just so you know, there are 29 varieties of 501c classification. So I'm guessing that many of you on the call today are 501c3s or 501c6s. Those are the organizations we tend to work with the most, but there are actually, it starts at 501c1 and goes up to 501c29, and they all have different regulations, requirements, and details that are important for you to know based on your particular classification. The tax returns also, just so you know, the 990s that go in, they are generally due the 15th day of the 5th month following your year end. So for any December 31st year ends, that's going to be May 15th. And for those of you that have a June 30th, that's generally going to be November 15th. As we talk about the state requirements, there also are the state tax returns that have to be filed. And again, there are payroll obligations at the state level that also have to be managed. There is often, I know in Illinois, we have an annual report that goes in, and that is just a way to keep our organizations in good standing. If we need, occasionally we've had to file grant applications or do certain processes that require a certificate of good standing, which also comes from the state. So making sure that you have your annual report filed so that they know who your board members are, they know who's managing your organization, they know that you're meeting, again, those nonprofit requirements is incredibly important. They're often not very expensive, but they are important for you to submit, because if you miss any, like the federal tax return, the state tax return, or the state annual report, you can actually put your 501c organization in jeopardy. And I know that with 3 years of non-filing, that they can actually revoke your status and cancel your organization. So incredibly important. And then there are various licenses and permits, again, that happen at the state level. We've added a link in the chat that is a link from the IRS, again, out, and it has a link for each particular state in the United States, just to give you the direct connect to the best information for your organization wherever you're located. The local government gets a little bit trickier. Not everybody posts the information out the same way that the states and the federal governments do, but I encourage you to definitely reach out to your local government and just make sure that you know what requirements might be expected of you at that level. Especially, I've found personally with the organizations we've worked with, there's not always returns required, but sometimes there is certain reporting, and especially special licenses and permits start to come into play a lot more. As an example, we've done an awful lot of events in the city of Chicago, and the city has a very specific requirement for all of their licenses and permits around public events. And especially if we're serving food, there's usually guidelines from the health department and things of that nature. So those are some good examples about when you definitely want to check in with your local government to just make sure that you're doing everything right. And then, of course, when you get to the organizational level, you have your bylaws and your policies. And these are your internal rules and regulations. It really gives you the structure that you need within your organization and the processes for making changes to your organization as well. So it's important, I think bylaws really help mandate and dictate how an organization is run. And that's really good for continuity and consistency from board, from one executive board to the next, from one group of directors to the next. It helps make sure that you have a guiding principle for your organization. And we're going to talk a lot more about the bylaws in detail later. I want to talk a little bit about what I like to think of as governance specialties too. And this is all stuff, again, when I started, it really was, I was flying by the seat of my pants and trying to figure it all out. And so, again, making sure there's so many legal nuances, and even in the nonprofit space, trying to have an attorney that you're connected to that really specializes in the nonprofit space is important. I think a lot of organizations will put somebody on their board who is a lawyer, but they might practice family law, and that's very, very different than the nonprofit space and all of the nuances that apply to your nonprofit organization. So when possible, I think it's advisable to try to have somebody who is a good legal counsel that specializes in the nonprofit arena. Also, when it comes to accounting and finance, there are so many details and policies that really need to take place. And I have seen some of the worst management happen in this category. I've heard horror stories of organizations who have had money embezzled from them because they do not have good accounting and finance policies. They do not have the appropriate checks and balances, and that leaves everybody in a really risky position. So you want to make sure that there are accounting and finance policies set up. You want to know who can be signers on the account. You want to know what the threshold is for a single signer maybe versus dual signatures. You want to have an approval process whereby everything is getting reviewed on a regular basis. So I know for a lot of organizations that we work with, the executive director, or if they have a dedicated finance person, they can sign, the checks within the organization, but then there's a treasurer or an accountant who's reviewing those reports on a quarterly or a monthly basis to make sure that all of the money that's flowing out is matching the budget, it's in alignment with what was expected, and they have the opportunity to review those. And obviously then monthly, the report should be shared with your board holistically so that everybody has a chance to ask questions. And if that's not being done, that puts everybody in jeopardy. And I know that some savvy board members have actually investigated what are your financial policies, how is the risk mitigated, and that's a determinant about whether or not they'll consider applying for your board. So I encourage you to make sure you've got good policies set up there. You can work with your accountant, work with your team to make sure that that is set up appropriately. And always have a budget. I think that's another accounting and finance protocol. And I know it probably sounds simple, and some of you are probably like, that's a no-brainer. But we actually have seen some very large organizations who did not have an appropriate budget, and they could not really navigate themselves well. So knowing what your budgeting process is, knowing how you approve any overages in the budget or how you review and evaluate that budget, all of that is incredibly important to make sure that you are keeping your organization on good financial footing. And another finance policy that I think has come into light more now than it was, when I first started in the nonprofit space, but is PCI compliance and credit card policies. So those are some other examples of good policies that you want to have in place. Social Security and credit card fraud, like those things really didn't exist when I first started in this nonprofit arena. And over time, they've become incredibly important, and everybody's afraid of, having their identity stolen these days. And it's messy for those people who have experienced that. So making sure that you are not holding on to personal information, making sure that you are shredding and destroying information if maybe you have had it for a reason, and following good credit card rules around that PCI compliance. I know that for those of you who don't know what PCI compliance is, it is around your credit card processes. And that in particular, if you do go through the PCI program every year for an approval, then you can usually have a reduction in your credit card fees. So that's something to talk to your credit card company about if you don't know what I'm talking about and that doesn't make sense to you, because it might be able to save you a few $100s annually. And it also, in working with your credit card provider, they will often help you understand best practices. You should never hold on to credit card information in your office. It can be very put you at risk, and if that information is easily accessible by volunteers or different levels of staff, it can just put you at risk for being able to have your list stolen or having that information compromised, and that is something that you want to avoid against. Lobbying is another area that it can get very tricky. So depending on your particular 501c level, it is incredibly important to know what can be done around this. And I think having lobbying processes and protocols that speak to your particular organization becomes incredibly important. Your board members may be very active in the political arena, and they're, it's important that they never take a stance that would indicate that that's the stance of your organization for a lot of nonprofits, because they are not supposed to be specifically endorsing candidates and things of that nature. So whenever a board member is really working on an organization's behalf, it's incredibly important that they hold their personal views in check when representing the organization, and that if they are representing themselves, that they also remember they're part of an organization where that might impact you. And it really does vary. There are a couple of classifications that are very specifically political framed, and many nonprofits might have a political action committee where the politics and the processes can be a little bit different, but making sure that any lobbying activity is managed appropriately based on your state and federal guidelines for your classification becomes very important. Fundraising is another area that people don't often think about some of the details. There are often mandates at your state level in particular that are going to give you some guidance about what you can and can't do on fundraising. It is incredible too that one of the things I was unaware of when I first started was that it's unethical to compensate fundraisers based on percentages of funds raised. And so I know that a lot of people will try to, a lot of my board members actually, they suggested, can't we get this person to come in and fundraise for us for a percentage of what they raise? And that's just unethical. That's unethical for grant writers. The Association of Fundraising Professionals has a really good guide to ethical fundraising that I would also encourage you to check out if you're not well versed in this area. And that's another place that you want to make sure if there are any guidelines for your state that you're also meeting. Fundraising, if you are accepting donations from multiple states, then usually you have to register in those states so that you can receive donations from people in that state. And so making sure that if you are in multiple locations and fundraising across the country, that you are savvy about that, or working with somebody who can give you good guidance, and then managing those applications on an annual basis or whatever that period of time is becomes incredibly important as well. We're going to talk a little bit about insurance. And insurance, I think, is a tricky a tricky spot because there's a lot of different coverages out there, and a lot of companies will try to tell you that you need an awful lot of coverage, but most nonprofits can't afford all of the coverage. There are a couple that you want to make sure you have, and I'm going to start with liability insurance. It's incredibly important that you have liability insurance for your organization, especially if you're hosting events, if you are managing just even day-to-day operations, if you have an office, if somebody comes in and slips, you're at risk. So you want to have that liability insurance that's going to protect your organization, and hopefully it will cover a lot of the events you have. But sometimes you do want to talk to your insurance broker and just verify what might be needed for special events. Some large-scale events sometimes need an additional rider for the period of time that the event will take place. And so working through those details can become really important. You should also have directors and officers liabilities insurance. And again, most people, if they're savvy, will not necessarily consider your board without D&O insurance. This is what protects them if the organization gets in trouble, because quite frankly, if they're on your board and you do not have D&O insurance and somebody sues your organization, they can actually go after your board members too. So I believe these two policies to be of the utmost importance and that every organization should have them. Workers' comp, if you have employees, I know in the state of Illinois, it's a requirement that you also have workers' comp insurance to protect your people. You might need automobile insurance if you have vehicles for your organization, or if you have members of your staff who are driving regularly, then you might need to also consider having that auto insurance to cover them. If you own property, you're going to need to have property insurance. I like to talk about event insurance because there's a small difference in that liability insurance that I talked about. You can get a rider that will cover your event for any problems at the event, if somebody gets injured, if there is damage due to equipment, things of that nature. But event insurance differs from what I like to call rain insurance, which has become a thing over the last few years. We do personally some here at Big Buzz, we do some outdoor events, and they can be very risky. And so a lot of organizations have questioned rain insurance and looked at it. And in doing that deeper dive, again, it's worth checking out. You may need to, your board might suggest or want to know more about it, and you may need to do your due diligence. But usually what happens is that the rain, you have to take the insurance for a very specific portion of time during your event, and you have to estimate the actual amount of rain you're going to get. But then they don't necessarily evaluate the rainfall at your location. They will evaluate the rainfall at the nearest weather center, which might be a nearby airport or a nearby city if you're in a smaller town and things of that nature. So making sure you know how that insurance policy would work is incredibly important. And what we have traditionally found is that the rain insurance is so pricey, and you have to be so specific in when the rain will come and how much will come, that it doesn't very often actually protect an organization. So make sure you're doing your due diligence and evaluating those policies holistically. Another insurance that is very common is errors and omission. And this is something that helps cover you in what you put out to the public, and just if there is an accidental oversight or misinformation, the errors and omission insurance can cover you. Nowadays, also cybersecurity is something that has come into play. There is terrorist insurance after 9/11 that started to be talked about a lot more. And so continuing to see what makes sense for your organization based on what you provide becomes incredibly important. And again, you can see that an expert in that arena becomes incredibly valuable. So having somebody in your community, or being able to, and sometimes even comparing quotes and having an expert you can talk to is important. I had a great conversation yesterday with someone who, they have such a trusted insurance advisor that they were able to go out and get multiple bids and be able to they were confused and having trouble comparing the policies apples to apples, because that's not the language they speak. That's not the world they live in. And luckily, one of the partners was such a good partner and so involved with that business that they absolutely told them they should go with an alternative provider, because that was the best option, and they couldn't believe what the deal was that they were getting, and even guided them through what questions to go back to the broker and ask to make sure that everything got buttoned up properly. So you really want to have those trusted partners, and they're going to go a long way in helping you know what you don't know. And oops, I'm sorry, I rolled too fast. And then also your medical experts. A lot of you may be in healthcare or in specific industries. And so making sure that when you're talking about governance, you might have some medical specialties and need to make sure that you are giving out the proper information in the proper way, and not overstepping any boundaries that could put your organization at risk. So I encourage you to continue to lean on the experts that you need to function appropriately. When we talk about your bylaws, again, I think that these are so incredibly crucial. I can't even begin to tell you, I guess I really feel like an example of how to do everything the wrong way, because when I first became an executive director, I had no clue what bylaws were. I didn't know they existed. I did not refer to them properly until I was at least a year into my role. It's embarrassing to admit that, but you don't know what you don't know. And so I want to talk about bylaws today because they really are your governing document. They are your compass. They help you maintain leadership in an effective way. And it's your job as the leader of a nonprofit to make sure that your board and your organization is adhering to your bylaws. So it's important to know that you're reviewing them and looking at them. They should talk about the roles and responsibilities of your organization. They should talk about your mission. They should tie back to those original 501c documents that you filed to get approval for your 501c organization, and continue to hold you accountable for what your mission is of the programs and services you offer. They also are going to talk about roles and responsibilities within your organization. So, your board members, your staff, your committees, they really are going to be able to give you the mandate of how many people should be on your board. What are your staff responsibilities in interacting with your board? What is the division of responsibilities between the board and the staff? And so a good document helps outline all of that so that it's easier for you to teach your board members and your executive committee what they need to know about your particular organization. They're going to help you with board management. They're going to mandate your size. They will talk about usually a minimum and a maximum. In the state of Illinois, you have to have a minimum of 3 board members on your board to make it qualify as the appropriate requirement. So you want to make sure you know those types of things. And then obviously some of organizations we work with have also national guidelines. And so they may mandate minimums and maximums on top of that. And you want to know that and have that reflected in your bylaws. Terms and term limits. We recently became aware of an organization that unfortunately they had no term limits. The first time that I became an executive director, there were no term limits. The organization had been filed in 1949, and I was on the leading the organization in 1999, and we still had one of our original board members on that board 50 years later. The shortest term that anybody had been on that board was 15 years. And so it's really important for a variety of reasons. If you participated in our recent board meeting discussion or board recruitment discussion, then you know how important these term and term limits are. You need freshness of perspective. You need new energy. people get burnout. And when I went into that organization, I think by no fault of the board, they just had been there a long time. They were not as engaged and they were not as active. And that made it harder for me. I wanted an engaged board. So it's important to look at terms and term limits, to get fresh perspectives, to get new people asking questions. I think that we want people who ask the right questions to be able to drive and elevate our organization to a higher level. And so it's really important to have those new expertises, new faces, new minds, new thinking to really continue to evaluate these things. And so you should have term and term limits in your bylaws. Generally, we find 2-year terms work really well, and we find that then most boards, boards may have a limit of how many terms you can fulfill. So you can still have some good board members on there for 2, 4, 6 years, but making sure you're also mixing it up with some freshness and new people. The bylaws should guide you on what that selection process is. It really should allow you to know what your nominations process is. It should allow you to know what your voting process is. And you want to make sure you're adhering to that so that nobody can say that you're operating outside of your rules and guidelines, and it would negate your board selection. It may talk about your diversity processes. That also is incredibly important and more now than ever. But I think knowing what your mix is, knowing what you're striving to achieve in the boardroom, incredibly important. And again, it should be in your bylaws. Also, you want to know what to do for nominations and resignations. In the event that you unfortunately have a member of your board who has to maybe end their term early, what are the processes for filling that vacancy? What has to happen to be able to keep your organization in compliance and running efficiently? So you want to make sure that you know what that is. Excuse me, your bylaws are also going to include your meeting guidelines. So they will talk about how frequently your organization needs to come together as a board. How often do you need to meet with your members if you are a membership-based organization? It will talk about what committees you should have for your particular entity. Again, those membership regulations. Also, your relations to the national or the parent organization might be documented in there, and that helps everybody get aligned and be aware of what those requirements are, and becomes incredibly important. There should also be rules for approvals and changes to the bylaws. You don't want to, the bylaws are usually a document that, most organizations are not changing every year by any stretch of the imagination, but you do want to review and update them periodically. And you need to know what the process is when you need to make an edit to those bylaws. A lot of the bylaws have to go out for approval to your membership. If you're a membership organization, it might just be mandated within your board, depending on the structure of your organization, but you want to make sure you know what that is. And it's incredibly important, as I've mentioned, just from the time I started in the nonprofit world in 1999 to now, the way that things have changed have been incredibly drastic. And so reviewing and updating the bylaws to be able to keep up with the current times also becomes incredibly important. The other document that a lot of organizations have, some of these items are included in some bylaws documents, but it's becoming a better practice that you may also have a policies and procedures manual that supplements your bylaws. So the bylaws are a little bit more strict. They're a little bit more detailed on the things that are kind of more set in stone for your organization. And the policies and procedures manual allows a little more fluidity. So job titles and job descriptions, they could go in either place, but as a board is expected to oversee the executive director, and the executive director is then expected to oversee most of the staff, that's a best practice. And so job titles and job descriptions for maybe the rest of the staff might be better suited in a policy manual. You also want to have job titles and job descriptions for all of the officers of your organization, for your committee chairs, and even for what is expected of a general director. Other policies that we recommend and encourage as a best practice are a conflict of interest. It again, I learned the hard way that the founding member of that of the organization I was originally an executive director for, he was also the paid accountant. And so that was a conflict of interest, as generally is a rule and a best practice that you don't pay anyone on your board. Sometimes they may be a service provider, and so sometimes they need to abstain from certain decisions, or they need to, you know, be able to still do the competitive bid, and you want to make sure that you're covering, your organization may have a process to, you know, cover, just cover your organization by doing a competitive bid to know that the board member gave the best price and being able to execute on that. But you've got to know what your conflict of interest policy is for your organization. And it's incredibly important that you are not regularly paying people on your board. And quite frankly, like a good example is, so we at Big Buzz are often asked to enter into board service. And unfortunately, because we do a lot of paid services for a lot of organizations, it's important that we manage that. We can't really have the same distance and the same objectivity for the organization if we are a board member as if we are servicing the organization. And so if we are on a board for an organization, then we generally are not a service provider for them. And if we're a service provider, we generally would not then step into a leadership role on their board. So just being aware of what that is and how that operates within your organization, and having that documented allows you to treat all people the same way. And I will say about a lot of these things that having these policies protect you. Oftentimes, we have seen that organizations evolve, they have a situation, and then a new policy is created. And that's very natural. But the more you can be proactive and think about these things before they become a problem, the stronger your organization is going to be. And I've had the situation too, where you want to, by having a policy or a procedure documented, you can then also make sure you are treating all suppliers, all members, all vendors in an equal and fair way. And nobody can really say that there's, you know, mistreatment or favoritism taking place, which we have seen become an issue for some organizations. You want to have a diversity policy. Again, it's important that you know the stance of diversity for your organization. We've heard that over the last year, as this has become more important to a lot of nonprofit staffs, that, you know, really making sure their board is on board with this has become sometimes an issue. Some board members, you know, are not as open or receptive to new policies, but really thinking about what stance your organization wants to take on this and being able to be clear and again, utilize that as a guiding principle for how you execute all that you do is important. Code of ethics becomes incredibly important. Again, making sure your board members know that they are operating on your behalf, knowing that your staff members are operating on your behalf. Most people, if they are really operating in true servant leadership, they know why they're there. They know that they're serving the organization and the nonprofit. They know they're a representative, and they know that they have to always, you know, be clear if they're serving the organization or are they doing something as themselves as an individual outside of company time. But making sure you have that code of ethics can just be a good barometer for everybody to follow and make sure that people are having, you know, sometimes it's the difficult conversations in a respectful way for the best management of your organization. We've seen more and more whistleblower policies coming to the forefront these days, and I continue to think that this is important. Many people, you know, it's hard in a nonprofit to be able to know if there is inappropriate behavior or inappropriate actions that might be taken at different levels within an organization. We have worked with clients who, you know, the organization runs really well, the board is on board, the staff is acting appropriately, but unfortunately they work with volunteers and volunteers had misconduct. So making sure that there are policies, and even within the staff, What is the policy if there's a staff member and they feel that their needs are not being addressed? How is your board protecting your staff and the members of your organization? So knowing what has to happen if there is an issue and having a whistleblower policy is becoming a standard in the industry as well. Social media, we've seen an awful lot of problems with organizations struggling with social media situations. So having a social media policy is incredibly advisable, because lots of times you may have a board member or you may have a service provider and they may set up your social media, they may create the accounts, they may manage those accounts, but you want to make sure that you own those accounts. You want to make sure that you are on those accounts so that if the volunteer disappears on you, you can still access your accounts. Social media does not make it easy to transfer ownership. They do not make it easy to necessarily get back into accounts that you've been locked out of. And so it's incredibly important that you have a policy and a procedure, and that anybody who works on your social media, again, agrees to the terms with which they represent your organization and how they share content and what that looks like. Again, I talked a little bit about the financial policies. I think the financial policies are some of the most incredibly important parts of an organization and protecting yourselves. And again, I think lots of times, small organizations will put a lot of the financial control in the hands of one person, and that is just not the best practice. If that person, unfortunately, something would happen to them, if they would get sick, which we've seen an awful lot of in the last year, it leaves the organization without the ability to maybe make payments and to continue to stay current on their financial responsibilities. So you really do want to have multiple signers on your account. You want to have a review process set up in your organization. Again, making sure that you're budgeting and you're tracking on that budget on a regular basis is incredibly important. You want to make sure you've got a knowledgeable person completing your tax returns, and then that the review is being done by the board of those financial documents. I've sat on boards where I know that the people around the table did not have the knowledge or the experience of understanding the financial statements, and that really does a disservice to the organization. So I think it's important that you not only have the policy, but then I also think that it's important that you educate your board. And we'll talk about this a little bit more as we move on to the next couple of slides. But when we are talking to a board, a lot of those people, they may be a manager in a business. They may not be a business owner. And so they may not be aware of what is required at the highest level of ownership and management. And theoretically, you as nonprofit leaders are the business owners. For the time that you are with an organization, you are acting primarily in that type of leadership role at that level. And so sometimes you have to educate your board and help them understand how to read the financials, what they should be looking for. We've seen a lot of organizations go to a dashboard, which helps organizations, I think, also know which numbers to focus in on a regular basis, to look at cash flow, cash balances, make sure that money is where they expect it to be, and if there's any ebbs and flows in the finances, to teach them to question why. And the more transparent and honest you can be around your finances, the more credibility your organization is going to have. For those of you who might be at a level of doing annual reports, most organizations put their annual reports right on their websites. And that is just, again, showing transparency and increasing credibility so that donors can trust in what you're doing and see specifically how your money is being allocated and accounted for. So financial policies are something we cannot stress enough. Also, around those financial policies, you may want to also have contract rules. As your organization enters into contracts, you may want to set guidelines or best practices for, do they need to provide you a certificate of insurance? Do you need to verify that they have the appropriate level of insurance for their company to make sure that your organization is protected? And so, how you, at what level do you go out to bid on contracts? What is a small enough dollar level that you can just approve a vendor versus when do you need to bid it out? How many bids do you need to get to effectively compare and contrast what your organization is getting and make sure that it's a good value? Because we all know that every nonprofit dollar really matters. Also, as we've entered through COVID, I think emergency plans are on more people's radar and something that not enough people had thought about prior to the pandemic. But you should have an emergency plan in place for your organization and just making sure that you are thinking ahead and again, being proactive. And then you need to also think about other policies and procedures that may apply specifically to your organizations. I continue to talk a lot. We work with an awful lot of healthcare organizations and those that are rooted in service in the medical field. And there are just extra expectations and layers of activity and policies that need to take place there. I know especially during COVID for some of our folks who managed homes for some of their constituents and the people they serve, they had to have extra policies around COVID to make sure that they were keeping everybody healthy in their organization and protecting the lives that they were responsible for. And it was very difficult separating, some family members from the residents temporarily and things of that nature, and having to set up virtual protocols because they couldn't see each other in person. It was difficult, but they had to do it for all the right reasons. So making sure you have those types of things that are specific to your organization outlined and documented, equally valuable. So it's important that we talk about the role of your board. The role of your board is to make sure they are protecting the organization as a whole. It is important for them to understand that governance and compliance is one of their main responsibilities. It's important they are looking at the strategic planning for your organization, knowing your mission, setting clear goals and objectives. Most of your documents state what you are meant to do. And there are actually penalties and concerns that can be raised to your organization if you get too far off of your scope of service. So making sure everybody is clear and you know how you're serving your mission is incredibly important holistically. The board's job is also to evaluate the roles of the board members and the overall board for effectiveness. It's important that they are objectively looking at, are they performing well? What could they be doing better? What would make them a better board for your organization? As I mentioned previously, their job is to also provide evaluation of the executive director on a regular basis. And then the executive director is responsible for other staff. We've seen an awful lot of board members going directly to staff members. And sometimes there's a working relationship maybe between a committee chair and a staff member, but it's really important that you know where those roles and responsibilities, are the lines of responsibility are drawn to keep everybody in the appropriate lanes of service. The board needs to review and evaluate your financial metrics on a regular basis. It is incredibly important that your board members know what to look for on the financials, and that, again, whether it be an accountant that teaches them, whether it be you that does it during your annual retreat or your onboarding, but it is so incredibly important that they understand their responsibility for financial management of the organization and that they're reviewing that regularly. It is their job to also ensure that all federal, state, and local obligations are met. They have, again, a responsibility as a board member at that table. And that is part of why at the state level, a lot of the the Attorney General here in Illinois, you list out your board members. They want to know who's serving because they want to know who's accountable for your organization. So making sure, again, that there is a transparent schedule of filings, making sure that they know when that is, making sure that your executive committee is engaged and aware that that schedule is being met. It's important. The role of your board is to stay informed about the activities of your organization too. I know one nonprofit leader who she stresses over and over and over ad nauseum that the most important thing for her board to do is to read the emails, because that is how they stay informed. And she says, if you do nothing else, you have to read the emails. So it's so incredibly important. She kind of makes a joke about it, but she says it enough that you know it's serious at the same time. And so it is really important to keep your board informed about all of the activities so that when they're needed, that they're up to speed and they know what's happening within the organization. It's also the role of the board members to be ambassadors and connectors, both within the organization and outside of the organization. Their job is to be a conduit of goodwill to continue to help your organization thrive, grow, and expand in a meaningful way. So what is your role? Your role is to know the requirements for your entity. Again, there's a lot of details based on what type of entity you are. So you want to take the time to get really clear on what that is. You want to know your bylaws. If you haven't read them recently, I encourage you to make time to do that soon and continue to evaluate if there are things that might need changed, especially if they haven't been reviewed in a long time. Again, I can't stress enough the importance of educating your board. We often want to believe that board members come in knowing how to be a good board member. You may even have a board member who served on several other boards, but unfortunately, they really may not know enough. They may not have been trained well at their other roles. And so really looking at them as a first-time board member and how you want your board members to operate is incredibly in your hands, and it's up to you to make it happen. Maintain all monthly, quarterly, and annual filings. Again, I referenced the master calendar. I think it's a great way to help make sure that all of those details are being met. There are programs, if you're with a payroll service, they can help with the payroll tax returns. They can help with a lot of those details. And I think that that can help manage that in a very good way too. And then, of course, your job is to protect your nonprofit status. And that's where it becomes important for you to understand all of these pieces and how they feed into each other. For those of you who have employees, HR compliance is incredibly important. You want to have a process for onboarding your staff. Again, having a policies and procedures manual specific to the daily operations of your organization is important, partially to ensure that you are adhering to the same rules for all of your staff. Again, no favoritism, no favorites. We've seen people get sued for discrimination because there weren't policies and procedures in place, and people felt that it was not fair and equitable across the organization. So just make sure that you are creating that document. And this is a document that also needs to be revised on a regular basis because rules change. Use of social media at work may change. Use of personal tools. Again, with the pandemic, everything changed on working from home. Do you have a working from home policy now? What is the expectation for Zoom? So just really making sure you're managing that across your staff is important. Again, insurance requirements and making sure they're met for your staff is important. The workers' comp we talked about earlier. Knowing the taxes and the details around when they have to be remitted, making sure you know the reporting schedule for having staff and what that looks like. And also, I hadn't mentioned the unemployment security, but that is also a payment that has to happen. And so knowing those state requirements, again, the local state payroll detail, so important for you to investigate and make sure you understand what that looks like. And I encourage you to have an offboarding policy. I know an organization who recently lost employees. Well, not recently, actually, it was a few months ago, but they still have some of their accounts and some of the way that the items show up is still in a past employee's name. So, we really had to advise them to get that changed. You want to make sure when do passwords and logon credentials need to be changed. How do you track that stuff? What does that look like? And obviously always getting feedback from anybody exiting your organization. Those employees can be a valuable source of information. And this is true as well for your board. They can give you great insights, and making sure you're capturing that is a good idea. A couple other best practices before we move into questions. Fundraising requirements, I also want to draw to everybody's attention. Raffles and bingos often require separate licenses, usually from your state and your local municipalities. So I encourage you to know what those are. I know one organization, we tried to advise them that they should not mail their raffle tickets out in the mail, but they did, and they were all returned. It was amazing to me that the USPS somehow knew what was in the envelope, or had the wherewithal to know they should open one of them, and they found what that bundle of mail was, and they absolutely returned them all to the nonprofit. And it really left them in dire straits because they had not just taken the time to get the raffle license on the front end and make sure that they knew what the requirements were. It's also important, we advise a lot of our clients, if you're having a drawing and it's not actually a financial raffle, use the word drawing. We've had some organizations where when they use the word raffle, there are protocols. You're supposed to have a certain license, and it's not expensive. It's about $100 for us here in the state of Illinois. But you do have to go through the process to make sure there's nobody who's had gambling addiction, and you don't have any criminals on your board, because otherwise, if anybody could create a raffle, that would just leave people to really take advantage of the system. And so they do it to protect the system and make sure that only authorized organizations are getting those approvals. But we have had some organizations called out on that, questioned on that, and it has posed issues. So again, to just do everything to the best of your ability, you want to get those licenses and permits and make sure you're allowing time in your process, because some of these licenses do take up to 60 days to get. So you want to allow proper planning to get to that. You want to make sure that all net proceeds remain within the organization. Again, we talked a little bit about the fact that board members should not be paid, and this is not like a company where dividends are paid out at the end of the year. So everything stays within the organization for increased services, programs, saving for a rainy day. The first time that I was an executive director, I kept trying to get my organization to invest and save and put some funds to the side. And unfortunately, they did not see the value in that. They thought because we were a nonprofit, we needed to end at a zero balance every year. And then, now having seen 2008 and the economic drop, seeing the pandemic, the value and importance of a rainy day fund has increased substantially over the last few years. So again, you want to run like a business and have something set aside to protect your organization. But all net proceeds do need to stay within the organization and never should be getting paid out to a board. We encourage you to also have a policy around even if your board gets reimbursed for expenses, because usually most board members contribute at, minor expenses and what have you. And then also you want to have a governance committee. It's difficult for all of the pieces that you are managing on a regular basis to always stay abreast of changes and these nuances. And so having somebody on your board who understands the importance and takes a special interest in managing and helping you manage the governance is incredibly valuable. So we encourage you to do that. What we've seen also is sometimes the governance committee is a great place for some of your past presidents to continue serving, or those board members where maybe their terms have expired, but they still want to be of use to your organization. And if they were savvy and followed protocols well for you, the governance committee is a great place to ask them to continue their service. With that, I would love to open it up to questions at this time. So if you've got any questions, please be sure to drop them in the Q&A. And I know that I have seen a couple, how much of the finance oversight should be owned by the executive director versus the board or the finance committee. And so I really think that it's incredibly important for an executive director to really fully understand the finances of their organization. But I view it as a team. You need to have your accountant and your treasurer. Sometimes they're the same person, sometimes they're not. The accountant may do the tax return, the treasurer may look at the monthly financials. And so I think continuing to manage that becomes incredibly important, that you are a team and it really is a joint effort. The finance committee can make recommendations to the board. It's another good layer to oversight and to also just protecting yourself. If you're doing all of the financial decisions yourself, I think you're putting yourself in a risky position, because people can say that you did things out of malice or, from that it was not the right thing to do, and they can accuse you of mismanagement. But when you're working with a group and the finance committee then makes recommendations to the board, and then the board is making approvals, it just keeps everybody in that loop, so you're working as a harmonious team. I hope that answered that question. Regarding educating the board, is that a responsibility of the existing board, and how much should staff be involved? So for the organizations where I serve as executive director or where we work with executive directors, I encourage them to guide a lot of that process. I think that you want to set up a standard, and when you have a good, strong executive committee or a strong president, you can work with them. But sometimes we have weak presidents. And sometimes I think we have to take responsibility for trying to make that better. The good thing too is if you start to set up a binder, I love to have binders to welcome on new board members and use as the guideline through the retreat. I think every year our retreats generally might change a little bit. They may flex, they may have some additional components, do some breakouts and discussions, but you want to have a certain amount of management for the organization that you go through. And then you want to understand too, if you are having a retreat, it can be difficult for everybody to take on so much information in one sitting, one long extended day. So keep reviewing a little bit every month in your board meeting too about the importance or about what's happening to keep people on board and educating them. But I think again, your leadership, my best wish for all of you is that you have a strong president and strong executive committee, and they work with you to educate and train your staff. But I absolutely think that you as the executive director want to be guiding that. And sometimes you have to, especially if you have board members, again, maybe they're managers, maybe they're with a local business and they want to support you, or they're just passionate about your cause, but they know nothing about management. So it's important for you to lead that discussion. All right. Let's see, in terms of standard church organizations, should they become 501c, etc.? Our parent organization is a 501c organization. Should do so also? I would encourage you again to talk to somebody who specializes in the legal expertise around that. Maybe talk to some similar organizations in your industry and look up the information for a standard church organization. Understand what your parent organization is mandated to do. And if they are a parent organization, they may have other affiliates under them that you can also lean on for some additional information. But again, that is a very specific niche, and you want to make sure you're going to resources that have the right answers for you there. Happy to talk more offline if I can be of assistance there too. And then let's see, we answered that. And then what is the initial or yearly cost of becoming a 501c organization, etc.? Great question. So again, a lot of the registration processes are, the largest expenses are in hiring an attorney or someone who's educated to do that work. but the IRS, the state, local municipalities, generally to get registered, there are not fees. They do not want those fees to be barriers to entry. They want to get you registered, or there might be a small nominal cost. I know, like I said, for the Secretary of State in the state of Illinois, it's $10 a year. You pay a $3 late fee if you miss your deadline. So they really do try to make it manageable. And there are some attorneys who specialize and accounting firms, that organizations that specialize in setting up organizations, and they can do it more effectively. So I also encourage you to shop around for some of the best pricing. And again, talking to people to see if what they're telling you matches up with the research you're doing, to make sure that you are finding the best price and the best service for your organization. I hope that that helps everybody. As we are coming up on time today, I want to talk just a little bit about the fact that we started these webinars about a year ago to try to bring education and information to nonprofit leaders during difficult times. We are excited to offer the Breakfast Club on the second Thursday of every month. And we also added roundtables which follow. So if you have more interest in talking about this particular topic, we will have the roundtable next Thursday at 11 for a nominal fee to participate, where it will be more workshop styled. And we will talk about sharing from your organization, what you're doing, what you found successful, where your pain points are, and we can group think any problems that you might be having and talk about ideas for resolving those. We also added power cells, and power cells are some of my favorite new services for us, in that we found that executive directors, I know from my past experience, you have to be on all the time, on for your staff, on for your board, on for your donors, and you need a place to be safe. You need a place where you can connect with other nonprofit leaders at your level, and you can just troubleshoot and talk about in a safe space ideas for how to resolve situations. So we also have launched the power cells, and we will be forming new groups. There's usually 3 to 4 executive directors in those groups that come together regularly for an entire year to talk about your problems and get to know one another better and share resources and ideas. And so I would encourage you, if you are interested in those, to reach out to us as well. And then we also offer direct consultation, and I remain available to help you if you can, if there's a way for Big Buzz to be of greater service. We often make referrals out or help you find the resources you need, even if we're not the right company to necessarily serve you. Our goal is to truly help you thrive and grow within your organization. I hope you found today's information useful, and we hope to see you back here again next month. Thank you so much for being part of this morning's Breakfast Club. Have a great day.